The Velthari had always believed the galaxy was full of friends. For centuries they had traded with dozens of species, signed peace agreements, shared technology, and sent diplomats to every corner of the known universe. They were a gentle people, tall and pale with long arms and hollow bones, who had not fought a real war in 500 years. They believed deeply and sincerely that talking could solve anything. They were wrong. The Korath Dominion did not negotiate. It did not send diplomats or sign agreements. It arrived with warships, destroyed whatever resistance it found, and moved on to the next target. The Korath were massive creatures, thick-skinned, cold-blooded, with wide flat eyes that never blinked. They had been conquering worlds for 200 years, and no one had ever stopped them. Not once. In the span of 3 years, the Korath had taken 11 Velthari colony worlds. Each one had fallen the same way. First came the dark shapes of Korath warships, dropping out of faster-than-light travel above the planet. Then came the bombardment. Then came the silence. The Velthari government, what was left of it, gathered on their last major diplomatic cruiser, a ship called the Eternal Threshold. It was a beautiful vessel, built for meetings and ceremonies, not for fighting. Its hulls were lined with soft lights and carved stone panels that told the history of Velthari civilization. Now, those halls were full of frightened officials, arguing in low voices. Fleet Ambassador Sorval stood at the center of the main communications chamber, and looked at the faces around him. He was old, even by Velthari standards, his white skin lined with age, his long fingers trembling slightly when he raised them to speak. He had spent 60 years building relationships across the galaxy. He had shaken hands with representatives of 43 species. He had believed, truly and completely, that the galaxy was a community. Now he was going to find out if that was true. He authorized a galaxy-wide distress signal, not just to their closest neighbors, but to everyone. The signal carried the full picture: Korath fleet numbers, destroyed colonies, casualty counts, the projected timeline for the fall of the remaining Velthari worlds. It was a complete and honest picture of how bad things were. Sorval was too old and too tired to dress it up. The signal went out, and they waited. Tira, the ship's chief xenobiologist, sat at a secondary console and tracked the responses as they came in. She was young for her position, barely 40 years old, with sharp eyes and a habit of clicking her teeth when she was nervous. She was clicking them a lot now. The Drenathi replied first. Their message was polite and full of regret. They cited something called strategic non-involvement, which was a very elegant way of saying they were afraid. Tira marked them down as a no. The Solvine Collective replied next. They said their fleets were currently restructuring. That was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. Their fleets were fine. They simply didn't want to be standing next to the Velthari when the Korath showed up. Tira marked them down too. More replies came, more regrets, more polite explanations. The Hurathi said they lacked the range. The Pelos Confederacy said they were in active negotiations with the Korath and didn't want to complicate things. The Marvini sent a sympathy message so beautifully written it almost made Sorval cry, but it contained no offer of help. 12 species, 12 refusals. Sorval stood quietly in the center of the room. Around him, his staff tried not to look at each other. The soft lights in the hall seemed dimmer now, though nothing had changed. The carved panels showing centuries of Velthari peace felt like a very long joke with a very bad ending. Then the console beeped again. Tira looked at the new message. She read it once, then she read it again. Then she turned slowly in her chair and looked at the ambassador. "Sir," she said carefully, "we have a reply from a species called humans." Sorval looked up. "I don't recognize that name." "Neither do I," said Tira. "They're from a single-planet civilization in the Orion Arm. Their world is called Earth." She pulled up the file quickly. They've only been in contact with galactic civilization for about 60 years. One inhabited planet, one moon base, a modest fleet. She paused. They're very new. What does their message say? Tira read it aloud. It was 8 words long. We are on our way. Earth Unified Command, Sol System. The room went quiet. Someone at the back said softly, "That's it? That's the whole message?" "That's the whole message," Tira confirmed. Sorval walked to her console and read it himself. He read it 3 times. He had spent his career analyzing diplomatic language, the careful phrasing, the layered meanings, the things left unsaid. This message had none of that. It was just a plain statement of fact, like someone saying they would be home for dinner. He found it more unsettling than all the refusals combined. "Pull everything we have on them," he said quietly. Tira worked for 2 hours. The file on humans was not large. 60 years of contact meant 60 years of data, which sounds like a lot until you compare it to centuries of records on older species. Humans were young. They were numerous, close to 14 billion, almost all on one planet. Their recorded history was full of wars with each other, which most species considered a very bad sign. Their planet was, and here Tira slowed down and read more carefully, genuinely hostile. Active geological systems, extreme weather, a remarkable number of organisms across the planet's evolutionary history that had been, at various points in time, apex predators. She flagged that last part and said nothing about it aloud. Sorval accepted the human offer, not because he was confident, not because the file inspired great hope. He accepted it because there was no one else, and because something about that short, calm, 8-word message had planted a small and stubborn feeling in his chest that he could not name. 3 days later, sensors on the eternal threshold picked up a cluster of ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. Tira pulled them up on the main screen. She stared at them. Then, very quietly, she started clicking her teeth again. The human ships looked wrong. That was the first thing Tira wrote in her observation log, and she circled it twice. She was a scientist, and she tried to be precise, but there was no more precise word for it. They looked wrong. Not broken, just built according to a way of thinking that made Velthari engineers quietly uneasy. Most spacefaring species built ships with some attention to elegance. Even warships tended to have smooth lines and balanced proportions. The human ships had none of that. They were thick, dense. The hulls were layered with armor plating that was, by Tira's rough estimate, 3 times heavier than anything structurally necessary. The ships were scarred not from battle, but from what appeared to be extremely hard and regular use. Stress fractures, repaired and re-repaired. Engine housings modified again and again. Surfaces marked by 1,000 small emergencies that had been dealt with and forgotten. Very serious tools, used by people who expected them to be pushed hard. There were 14 ships in the convoy. They moved in a tight formation that shifted constantly. Subtle adjustments, probing, as if the humans were rehearsing something, even while traveling. 2 ships peeled off and took up flanking positions without being asked, covering angles that Tira's own tactical staff had already identified as vulnerable. She flagged that in her notes. The communication request came from the lead vessel, a ship called EUS Resolute. Sorval accepted the channel and found himself looking at a man in a very plain chair in a very plain room. The man was solid, not enormous, but built in the way of someone whose body had been used hard for a long time. He had short dark hair going gray at the sides, a calm face, and eyes that were quietly taking in everything on the Velthari side of the screen. "Ambassador Sorval," the man said. His voice was level and unhurried. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Greer, Earth Unified Command. We got your signal. Sorry it took a few days to get here." He paused. "We'd like a full tactical briefing as soon as you're ready." Sorval had spoken to hundreds of military commanders in his career. Most of them opened with declarations of intent or careful statements of conditions. Aaron Greer opened with an apology for his travel time and a direct request for information. It was so simple that Sorval almost didn't know how to respond. "Of course," he said. "We can begin immediately." The briefing lasted 4 hours. Sorval's staff laid out everything: Koreth fleet strength, formation tactics, weapons, the engagement records of every battle fought against the Dominion in the past decade. The numbers were not encouraging. The Koreth had more ships, heavier weapons, and centuries of experience crushing this kind of resistance. Species with larger fleets had been swept aside. Aaron listened without interrupting. He took notes, and here Tira stopped and stared, because he was writing by hand, on what appeared to be actual paper, with a pen. She had not seen that in years. He filled 2 pages, asked 3 focused questions about Koreth formation behavior, in gravity wells specifically, and then said he needed a few hours with his team. During the briefing, Tira had been watching the human soldiers visible in the background of Aaron's video feed. They were not standing at formal attention. Several were sitting on the floor. 2 were passing something back and forth that appeared to be food. One, in the far corner, was doing slow push-ups. Not because he had been told to, apparently, just because he felt like it. They were talking to each other in low voices, and at one point, a group of 4 laughed. Not nervously, not politely, but with the easy laughter of people who were completely comfortable. Comfortable. That was the word that stayed with her. They had just been told in careful detail about a military force that had never lost a campaign. They had been shown images of destroyed cities and casualty reports that ran to the hundreds of thousands. And they were comfortable. Tira wrote in her log, "Possible psychological instability. Recommend further observation." Then she crossed out psychological instability and wrote unknown behavioral pattern instead. She was a scientist, and she didn't want to reach conclusions too quickly. But she left the original words underneath, where they could still be read. After the meeting, one of Aaron's junior officers, a young woman named Lieutenant Kara Webb, contacted Tira directly to ask about local star charts and gravity conditions near the contested colony worlds. The conversation was efficient and professional, but at the end, Kara asked, almost as an afterthought, what the Velthari ate. Tira told her. There was a brief pause. "Huh," said Kara. "Good to know. We brought plenty of our own food, but it's nice to have options." Then she smiled, wide and uncomplicated, and cut the channel. Tira sat with that exchange for a long moment. Then she pulled up the biological data on humans again and read it more carefully. The gravity on Earth was higher than on most inhabited worlds. The temperature range across its surface was extreme by galactic standards. The atmosphere had an oxygen content mildly toxic to several species. The sun was an aggressive yellow dwarf. The evolutionary history of the planet was, the more she read, relentlessly competitive. Species after species, across millions of years, locked in endless cycles of hunting and being hunted, adapting to disaster after disaster. Ice ages, mass extinctions, climate shifts that reshaped continents. And through all of it, one small, soft, slow, furless primate with no claws, no armor, no natural venom had not only survived, but had ended up at the very top of the entire system. Not because it was the strongest, not because it was the fastest, but because it was, apparently, very difficult to discourage. Tira closed the file. She looked out the viewport at the human ships, still running their quiet, constant formation drills in the dark. Then she opened a new message to Ambassador Sorval, and typed, "Sir, I think we should look at the Earth file more carefully before the engagement begins. Specifically, the section on evolutionary history. I believe we may have made an assumption about this species that the data does not support." She sent it. Then she went back to her console, and kept watching. Captain Drevin had studied 31 alien species in his military career. He had lived alongside 6 of them for extended periods. He considered himself a patient and open-minded observer, not easily surprised. He had volunteered to serve as the Velthari liaison to the human ground forces because he genuinely believed that understanding an ally was as important as understanding an enemy. He was not prepared for what he found. The humans had set up their forward staging area on the moon of Veth, a rocky body with higher-than-average gravity and minimal atmosphere, which required environmental suits for most species. The human soldiers wore suits too, but thinner ones than Drevin expected, and they moved in them with an ease that suggested the suits were more of a formality than a necessity. 2 soldiers were jogging the outer perimeter of the camp when Drevin arrived. Not on patrol, just running, because apparently they wanted to. He was introduced to the Ground Forces senior sergeant, a woman named Megan Colt. She was not the largest person in the camp, but something about the way she stood and the way people's eyes moved toward her when she spoke made it clear she was the center of gravity for the group. She shook Drevin's hand with a grip that was, in his professional assessment, entirely unnecessary. Not aggressive, just present. "Good to meet you, Captain," she said. "Come on, I'll walk you around." The camp was not large, but it was very organized. Every supply container was labeled and stacked with a specific logic. The weapon storage had a redundancy system that Drevin counted 3 layers deep. The medical station had been set up first, before almost anything else. The humans slept in short cycles of 4 to 6 hours, and seemed to find this completely normal. Several of them were awake at any given moment, regardless of the local time cycle, not because they were on duty, but simply because they didn't seem to need long rest. Drevin watched them eat. The ration packs they opened looked, by color and smell, like something that should not be consumed. He asked the camp's medical officer, a quiet man named Specialist Owen Trace, what was in them. Owen listed the ingredients with casual cheerfulness. Drevin's suit had a basic chemical analyzer, and he ran the list through it out of professional habit. The analyzer flagged 3 compounds as potentially harmful at elevated doses, and described the nutritional profile as dense and metabolically aggressive. Drevin decided not to share this with Owen, who appeared to be eating his ration pack with genuine satisfaction. On the second day, Drevin sat down with Corporal Kyle Denton, who had been assigned as his informal guide. Kyle was 23 years old, from a place on Earth called Ohio, and had the open, easy manner of someone who had grown up being friendly to everyone around him. He seemed to find Drevin's presence completely unremarkable, which was either rude or reassuring, and Drevin couldn't decide which. They shared a meal. Drevin ate his own supplies, while Kyle worked through something in a foil pouch that smelled strongly of processed meat. And Drevin started asking questions. "Your planet," Drevin said. "Tell me about it honestly." Kyle thought about it, chewing slowly. "Honestly, it's a lot. High gravity compared to most places from what I hear. Weather goes to extremes. We've got regions that hit 60 degrees in summer and -40 in winter. Active volcanoes, big storms. The ocean covers most of the surface, and it's full of things that will kill you if you swim in the wrong place." Drevin wrote notes. "And the other organisms? The animals?" Kyle nodded. "Yeah, we've got a lot. Most of them aren't dangerous anymore. We've kind of taken over the whole planet. But back when we were still figuring things out, our ancestors had to deal with everything. Big hunting cats, packs of predators, venomous things, things that were just enormous, things with tusks." He shrugged. "I think somewhere around 30 or 40,000 years ago, humans almost went extinct. The whole species got down to just a few thousand individuals." Drevin stopped writing. "What happened?" "We made it through," Kyle said simply, like it was not a remarkable thing to say. That's kind of the human answer to most things, honestly. What happened when it got really bad? We made it through. Drevin looked at him for a long moment. Kyle was not boasting. He was not trying to impress. He was just stating a fact. The way you might say that water was wet. It was the most casual description of near extinction Drevin had ever heard. "You are not afraid of the Koreth," Drevin said. Kyle tilted his head. "I wouldn't say that exactly. We know they're dangerous. We've read the files." He pulled at the foil pouch again, thinking, "I guess it's more like, being afraid doesn't change the math. They're there, we're here, somebody has to do something about it." He smiled a little. "So here we are." That evening, Drevin sent a long message to Sorval. He described everything he had seen in careful detail. The short sleep cycles, the food that should not have been edible, the constant physical training that the humans seemed to treat almost like entertainment, the quiet and natural way they discussed concepts like acceptable casualty rates and tactical attrition, as if these were simply practical problems and not terrifying ones. He described his conversation with Kyle about Earth's evolutionary history. He ended the message with one line: "I believe we may have accidentally recruited a planet of apex predators." On Earth, in a secure communications room at the Unified Command Facility, Colonel Diane Foster was reading through the Koreth tactical files for the fourth time. She was a small woman with close-cropped gray hair and the habit of pressing her lips together when she was working through something difficult. She had served in 3 colonial defense campaigns and had spent 20 years studying how wars were won and lost. She studied the Koreth carefully, their formation patterns, their engagement histories, the way they broke opposing forces, the way they pressed advantages, the way they responded when enemies held firm. Slowly, as she read, she began to smile. Not a warm smile, a careful, professional one. She picked up the channel to Aaron's ship. "You've seen their engagement records," she said when the connection opened. "I have," said Aaron. "They have never once fought an enemy that kept advancing after taking 30% losses. I noticed that." "They have no model for it," Diane said. "Every species they've beaten has folded when continuing to fight stopped being rational. Their entire approach is built around an enemy that makes logical decisions under pressure." She paused. "We don't always do that." "No," Aaron said. "We don't." The line was quiet for a moment. "They don't know what they've started," Diane said. "No," said Aaron. "They really don't." War Master Gorvek had won 42 planetary campaigns. He had won them all the same way, because the same way always worked. You arrived with overwhelming force. You demonstrated that force clearly. The enemy calculated the odds, recognized that fighting back was hopeless, and surrendered or ran. If they didn't do it the first time, you hit them harder until the math became obvious. It had worked on every species he had ever encountered. He arrived at Veth with 60 warships, 3 times the firepower he had needed for any previous campaign, because the Velthari had apparently found some kind of ally, and he believed in being thorough. His intelligence briefing described humans as a minor species, young, single-planet, unremarkable fleet. He noted them as a small additional variable and moved on. The battle opened the way it always did. Gorvek ordered an opening bombardment of the orbital defense platforms. The Velthari platforms fell, as expected. Then, his sensors tracked the human ships. They were moving toward him. Gorvek watched this on his tactical screen, with the flat curiosity of a man who had seen almost everything. In 42 campaigns, he had never once seen a defending force accelerate toward the attacking fleet. The logic was simple. If you were outnumbered and outgunned, you did not charge the guns. You fell back. You maneuvered. You looked for an advantage. You survived, because survival was the rational choice. The human ships were taking damage from the outer edge of his bombardment. His sensors confirmed hull breaches on at least 4 of their vessels. They kept coming. "They're still accelerating," his tactical officer said, in a voice that was trying very hard to stay calm. "I can see that," said Gorvek. The human ships drove straight into the middle of the Koreth fleet line, and split into two groups, as if they had decided the safest place to be was inside the enemy formation, where the large weapons couldn't fire without hitting each other. Two Koreth destroyers were disabled in the first 60 seconds. One human ship was venting atmosphere from 3 different points, and still maintaining full firing solutions. Gorvek had never seen anything like it, not in 42 campaigns. He had seen courage before. Other species had courage, but courage always had a ceiling, a point where survival instinct kicked in. These ships were past that ceiling and still pushing forward. He redirected 2 heavy cruisers to push the human fleet back into open space, the logical move. Re-establish distance, bring the big guns to bear properly. The human fleet split again. 4 ships broke off and went directly for his heavy cruisers. The other 10 pushed deeper into the Koreth formation. The 4 small human ships had no realistic chance against his cruisers, and clearly knew it. They did it anyway, harassing, flanking, drawing fire, forcing his captains to deal with them instead of supporting the main engagement. It was not a logical tactic. It was, however, effective. On the ground, things were going worse than expected. The Koreth landing forces had touched down in the ruins of Veth Crossing, the colony's main city, expecting a short and unpleasant urban sweep. Urban fighting was never pleasant, but the Koreth were experienced and well-equipped, and the city should have been secured in a few hours. Megan Colt and her soldiers had been in position for 6 hours before the Koreth ever landed. They had mapped every building, every alley, every underground passage in their assigned sector. They had identified overlapping fields of fire, secondary positions, fallback routes, and a dozen specific choke points where a small group of people could make a much larger one deeply regret its choices. The Koreth entered the sector and were immediately, professionally, made to regret their choices. The first contact happened in a narrow street between 2 collapsed buildings. Megan's team let a Koreth advance unit walk in, and then from 3 separate positions at different heights, opened fire simultaneously. The Koreth unit was gone in 11 seconds. The humans disappeared back into the rubble without leaving a single trace behind. This happened 5 more times in the next 2 hours. The Koreth pushed in with steadily increasing numbers. Megan's team retreated, but never away. Always inward, collapsing the Koreth advance into narrower and narrower spaces, turning the terrain itself into a trap that somehow always ended in another ambush. A Koreth sergeant sent back a field report describing the experience as fighting shadows. Megan heard about this later and seemed to find it funny. At the 4-hour mark, the Koreth pushed a full company into the main commercial district, a large open space that should have given their numbers room to move. Megan let them get halfway across it. Then she triggered the 3 structures she had spent the previous 6 hours quietly preparing. Not explosives. Structural failures, carefully engineered to bring exactly the right walls down on exactly the right positions, using the rubble as a weapon rather than an obstacle. The Koreth pulled back. They had lost more soldiers in 4 hours against a force a third their size than they had typically lost in entire planetary campaigns. The sector held. In orbit, Aaron had been absorbing ground reports while managing the space engagement. He sat in his chair with the calm, focused energy of a man doing difficult work that he was very good at. When the Resolute took a direct hit that knocked out a secondary power system, he acknowledged the damage report, asked if anyone was hurt, was told 2 crew members had minor injuries, said good, and told them to seal the affected corridor, and went back to his tactical screen without slowing down. He had been watching Koreth communication patterns for 2 hours, tracking the density of signals that indicated where command decisions were being made. When he was confident, he sent 2 destroyers on a long, curving approach that came in from below the Koreth formation's attention, and hit the command ship's drive systems from behind. The command ship went dark. Without central coordination, the Koreth fleet began to hesitate. Hesitation, in Aaron's experience, was always the beginning of the end. 20 minutes later, the Koreth fleet pulled back and stopped firing. Gorvek stared at his tactical screen and tried to understand what had just happened. His ships were damaged, his ground forces were pinned, his command vessel was crippled, and the enemy force, by every number he had, should never have been able to do any of this. He requested a complete intelligence review on humans. His intelligence officer had very little to give him, but she gave him what she had. As Gorvek read through it quietly in the dark of his damaged ship, a feeling moved through him that he had not felt in 42 campaigns. He sat with it for a while, before he understood what it was. He had felt it once before, very long ago, the first time he had walked into a dark place and realized, too late, that something else had already been there first. The silence after the Koreth fleet pulled back was the loudest thing Sorval had ever heard. He stood in the operations center of the Eternal Threshold and watched the tactical display. The red markers showing Koreth ships were still there. They hadn't left, just stopped. The human ships held their positions, moving in slow patrol arcs between the two fleets. The Resolute was venting something pale and faint from its starboard side, a long, thin trail in the dark, but it was still running full systems. Sorval had seen ceasefires before. He had seen retreats and tactical pauses, and the careful positioning that happened when two forces were deciding whether to keep fighting or start talking. He recognized immediately that this was different. This was not the Koreth pausing to recalculate. This was the Koreth stopping because they did not know what to do next, and they were not used to not knowing. In 200 years of Dominion history, nothing had ever made them stop and not know what to do next. He opened a channel to the Resolute. Aaron looked tired, not broken or shaken, just the honest tiredness of someone who had been doing difficult work without rest. He had taken his jacket off at some point, and there was a dark mark on his shirt near the shoulder, probably from when the Resolute had taken the heavy hit 3 hours ago. He was drinking something from a battered metal cup. "Ambassador," he said, "good news is they're not pushing. Bad news is we need to sort out a hull breach on the Harmon before we can move freely. Probably 4 hours." "You should rest," Sorval said, before he could stop himself. Aaron smiled slightly. "I will. How are your people?" Sorval had expected a tactical report or a proposal. Instead, Aaron asked about his people, and for a moment the ambassador didn't know what to do with that. "Shaken," Sorval said honestly, "but not broken. Cautiously hopeful, I think." "Good," Aaron said. "Hold on to that. It's useful." On the moon of Veth, in what had been a combat zone 6 hours before, Megan Colt was walking a slow circuit of her sector. Her soldiers were doing the same, coming down from the high tension of combat, quiet and careful, checking on each other in the easy, almost wordless way of people who had been through something together. She stopped at each position, said a few words, made sure everyone had water and food, and kept moving. Captain Drevin found her at the edge of the old commercial district, looking at the rubble she had brought down earlier. 11 hours, he said, against a force 3 times your size. Megan shrugged slightly. Not to dismiss it. Just because it was done, and she was already looking forward. Could have been cleaner. We lost a good defensive position in the 4th hour. I should have read the approach angle better. Drevin looked at her for a moment. "You are assessing your own mistakes." "Always," she said. "That's how you get better." She glanced at him. "How are your people?" She was asking about the Velthari soldiers who had held other sectors. Drevin had not expected the question, and found that it took him a moment to answer. "Alive," he said. "Grateful." Megan nodded like that was the most important information she could have received. She looked out at her soldiers moving in the middle distance, and her expression went quiet and warm, in a way that seemed separate from everything tactical and hard about the rest of her. "They worked really hard," she said. "They all deserve to go home. That's what I'm trying to make sure happens." Drevin had studied military cultures for years, and most of their leaders framed their purpose in terms of missions and objectives. Megan framed it in terms of the people next to her going home. He wrote that in his notes later, and stared at it for a long time. In the Kareth command vessel, Gorvek sat with his senior staff and read the full intelligence report on humans for the second time. His analysts had pulled everything, including records of human conflicts with each other, which were quite extensive. Humans had been fighting wars for almost as long as they had been a civilization. They had developed hundreds of different approaches to warfare, across different cultures and time periods, on land, at sea, in the air, and eventually in space. Through all of it, they had never stopped. The records made it clear that many human cultures had deep traditions of mourning their dead, of marking the real cost of conflict, of working hard to avoid it when possible. But when they couldn't avoid it, they came with everything they had, and they did not stop until it was over. Gorvek submitted his report to the High Council personally. He did not soften it. He described the engagement honestly, the human fleet's decision to charge rather than defend, the performance of the ground forces in the city, the tactical flexibility, the damage tolerance that exceeded anything the Dominion had encountered before. He described the biology. He described Earth's evolutionary history in careful detail. The final paragraph of his report read, "We did not encounter a young species. We provoked an old predator that had only recently learned to look upward." There was a long silence in the room. Then, for the first time in 200 years, someone at that table used the word negotiations. 3 days later, the Korath fleet left the Vet system without announcement. They simply went, one by one, until the sensors on the eternal threshold showed empty space where 60 warships had been. Gorvek's flagship was the last to jump. As it did, his second officer turned to him and asked whether this was a retreat. Gorvek looked at the space where the human patrol arcs were still moving, steady and unhurried. "It's a decision," he said. "There's a difference." On the eternal threshold, when the last Korath marker vanished from the sensors, someone in the operations room made a sound. Not a cheer, just a single long exhaled breath, the kind that comes when you have been holding something very tightly and are finally allowed to put it down. Then someone else made a sound, then another, and then the whole room was noisy in a way it had not been in a very long time. Sorval allowed himself 30 seconds of it. Then he straightened and asked for a full damage assessment. Aaron's voice came over the channel before Sorval could say anything else. "Congratulations, Ambassador." "We couldn't have done this without you," Sorval said. "You did more than you think," Aaron replied. "You held when it mattered. That counts." Kyle Denton, sitting in the back of a transport heading up to the orbital station for debriefing, wrote a letter to his family in Ohio on his tablet. He kept it simple because he was tired, and because some things were hard to put into words. He told them he was fine. He told them the job had gone well. He told them he had made some new friends, strange and gentle and a little cautious, but good people, the kind you'd want to have next door. He didn't mention the part about 2 colony worlds nearly being lost, or about the species that had never once lost a war deciding to go home. He figured that could wait until he was actually sitting at the kitchen table. He sent the letter and looked out the transport window at the stars. Megan was promoted 6 weeks later and given command of the first joint human Velthari training program. She thought it would be a desk assignment. On the first morning, when she walked into the training hall and found 40 nervous Velthari recruits looking at her with expressions of mixed hope and uncertainty, she understood immediately that it was not. She set her bag down. She looked at them for a moment, Then she said simply and calmly, "Okay, let's get started." The galaxy was quieter now than it had been in years. The Koreth had not moved against any new targets. Several species that had refused to help the Velthari had quietly opened communication lines with Earth, asking careful questions and trying to understand who these humans were and where exactly they had come from. But the Velthari already knew what those other species were still trying to figure out. They had seen the humans fight. They had watched them hold a city with a fraction of the needed force, charge a fleet that should have destroyed them, keep moving long after moving stopped making sense, and come out the other side tired and intact, and asking how their allies were doing. They were not weapons. They were not monsters. They were neighbors. Good ones. The kind that showed up when you called, that didn't ask much in return, that shook your hand a little too hard, and ate food that probably shouldn't be edible, and laughed easily in places where most people would be afraid. They were humans, and they had arrived.